2 years ago, Victoria's first State of Environment report was released by the Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability. And it wasn't just another report. It actually was the product of about 4 years' worth of research, and it was a clarion call to politicians, decision makers and the public that we needed to arrest the environmental decline that was gripping the state. It told a story of a disconnect between Victorians and our environment, and it concluded that our growing prosperity was masking the damage that we were doing to our natural environments, and that our natural systems were actually on the brink of collapse, particularly our rivers and waterways were on the brink of collapse. It highlighted that Victoria is a disproportionate contributor to problems like climate change, and it also highlighted that if everyone on the planet lived like Victorians, we'd need 4 planets to live. So this is not news. We know that we've got an urgent crisis, but this was a report that was tabled in Parliament, demanded a response from the Parliament. They actually had to formally respond to the reports. But as we fast forward 2 years to the final 48 hours of the election campaign, it's difficult to escape the conclusion that a business-as-usual approach to politics and a business-as-usual approach to the environment is just not up to the scale of the challenges we face. And throughout this election campaign, we've had more discussion of party preferences than we've had of environmental policy, and probably policy more generally. The big environmental issues like water, climate change and the state's biodiversity crisis have barely had a look in. And yet whoever wins government this Saturday will govern until 2014. It's a 4-year term of government. That's a critical window for action on some of the biggest issues that we face. It's a critical time in which we need to be addressing and making serious cuts to our greenhouse pollution, and it's a critical time for our natural systems, in particular our river systems. The climate science tells us that globally, we need to be seeing emissions fall by 2015 if we're going to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. We've already got a fair bit of climate change locked into the system, but if we're going to avoid the tipping points, global emissions have to fall in the next 5 years. Now, unless prosperous, developed economies like Victoria are making some large reductions to our greenhouse pollution in the next 5 years, we're not going to have any breathing space for the developing countries, which will, there's a degree to which emissions increases from developing countries are locked in the next 5 to 10 years. There's very little we can do about it. So countries like Australia and states like Victoria, if we're going to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, need to be taking serious action in the next 5 years. Closer to home, our systematic over-extraction from the rivers of the Murray-Darling Basin will need to be reversed in the next 4 years. In the next term of government, we will either make the decision to rescue the Murray-Darling Basin rivers and wetlands, or we will make the decision to allow them to die. Places like the Coorong, the Lower Lakes and the Red Gum wetlands and national parks in Victoria will need an allocation of water in the coming term of government if these places are going to survive. And Victorian government leadership will be critical to achieving these results nationally. And it'll also be really important that we've got Victorian government leadership on reshaping these regional communities and economies to protect both the environment but also to protect the community. So there's some very big challenges ahead of the next government, and they need to be up to the challenge. So what should we be doing? Well, environment groups, Environment Victoria, Wilderness Society, Friends of the Earth and the Victorian National Parks Association released our agenda 12 months ago. It's called Turning It Around, and it includes nearly 100 different policies that we need to be implementing from our perspective if we're going to be arresting environmental decline and facing up to the challenges that are ahead. And just to give you a snapshot of some of the things that we're asking for, on climate change, a really obvious starting point is to replace our most polluting power stations. And Hazelwood Power Station is the most polluting power station in the country. And it contributes 15% of the state's emissions and nearly 3% of national emissions. So it's an obvious starting point for action on climate change. furthermore, the company that owns the power station has conceded that it's willing to have conversations and enter into negotiations to close the power station. The unions in the Latrobe Valley last week congratulated the state government for showing some leadership and signalling the fact that Hazelwood was going to close in coming years. The community is ready for action on climate change, and we've done polling in key electorates in Victoria and found that community support for closing Hazelwood outranks any other action that we could be taking on climate change in Victoria. So there's a very clear argument, there's a very big opportunity, and we haven't yet grasped that yet. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Also on climate change, one of the biggest opportunities we've got to reduce emissions is to overhaul our building stock for energy and water efficiency. It's the lowest cost way of tackling climate change, and it also, of course, protects households and consumers and businesses from rising energy and water bills. So we've been working with the social sector, with organisations like VCOS and Brotherhood of St Lawrence and about 20 other partner organisations, calling for a retrofit of half of Victoria's housing stock in the next 5 years for energy and water efficiency. And that would, of course, have a whole lot of social benefits as well. It would be targeted at low-income households, anyone holding a concession card, and would deliver, a triple dividend of emissions and water reductions, jobs, and household affordability. So that's the sort of thing that we could be doing that would be delivering win-win-wins. We need to be getting water back into our rivers, and our priority has been delivering water to the red gum parks in northern Victoria. About 12 months ago, Premier Brumby declared a series of red gum national parks along some of the rivers that flow into the Murray and also along the Murray River. And it was a great announcement, but it's unfinished business because the national parks are actually wetland red gum stands, which are a natural wetland, and they need water periodically to survive. So if we can get water to the red gum parks, which are also an indicator of the health of all of those rivers that flow into the Murray, the Goulburn, the Campaspe, the Loddon, and also the Murray River, we will go a long way towards actually getting the water we need into those rivers and reviving the Murray River system as well. And other issues that we haven't been as active on, but others like the Wilderness Society and Victoria National Parks Association and Friends of the Earth have been leading on include, it's a key decision time for our native forests. We've seen a breakthrough in Tasmania with all parties coming to the table and an agreement to phase out logging of high conservation value forests. We've got an agreement to start the conversation in the state election, but really we haven't yet had a commitment to stop logging from happening in any of the coops that are slated for logging in coming months. And finally, we're in the grip, and this has not had anywhere near enough attention, we're in the grip of a biodiversity crisis in Victoria and Australia. Victoria is the most cleared state, it's got the most stressed ecosystems, and it's got among the highest rates of threatened species in the country. And yet we're doing very little to actually protect these threatened ecosystems, to manage them properly and to address the threats to them. So they're the sort of things that environment groups think we need to be doing to address the threats we're facing. So how do the two alternative governments stack up against the scale of the challenges and what needs to be done? So let's look at Labor first. I might just take a drink. On climate change, Labor's adopted a target to reduce the state's emissions by 20% by 2020. And while that's well short of what the science tells us is actually necessary, it's a much stronger target than any other state or our national government has currently adopted, with apologies to the ACT, who has a stronger target, but they don't have an industrial economy. The government, the ALP, has announced a plan to reduce emissions from brown coal electricity generation by up to 4 million tonnes per year by 2014. And to do that, they're targeting closing 1/4 of Hazelwood Power Station in the next 4 years, 2 of the 8 boilers at Hazelwood. They've announced plans to boost the energy efficiency of our homes, and they've actually they've set a target to get the average standard of Victoria's housing stock to 5-star by 2020, and the current average is around 2-star. So it's actually quite a significant announcement, but as yet we don't have the policy detail or the funding about how they're actually going to get there. They've also set a target for large-scale solar of 5% of our electricity to come from large-scale solar. So this is starting to add up to a strategy on climate change. But unfortunately, then there's some dissonant notes. So the emissions reductions that would be required to meet the 20% reduction target are largely being back-ended until the second half of this decade. So they're leaving the really hard work up to the next term of government rather than making the decisions that need to be made in this term of government. And of course that makes it even harder to reach the sort of scientifically required targets that we're going to need in the next decade. Labor's also granted $50 million for the construction of a new coal-fired power station in Latrobe Valley. And if that proceeds, it would wipe out the emissions reductions that would be achieved from closing one quarter of Hazelwood. So on the one hand, the public is potentially going to be paying quite a lot of money to retire a part of Hazelwood Power Station, and at the same time we're going to be paying quite a lot of money for the construction of a new coal-fired power station. So these dissonant notes seriously undermine the credibility of Labor's climate story. Elsewhere on other issues, Labor's committing, it's supporting negotiations to end native forest logging, but hasn't actually, as I said, committed to actually protect any threatened forests. It's investing in improving the efficiency of our irrigation systems in northern Victoria and promising that that will return 100 billion litres of water to our northern Victorian rivers, which is good, but it's about 1/8 of what they actually need. And they've also not changed their opposition to purchasing water back for our environment, which is the cheapest way, actually, of securing water supplies for the rivers and wetlands that need them. So overall, the nature conservation agenda of the ALP at this election is extremely lean, with no major new announcements to secure new protected areas or to boost biodiversity protection. Moving on to the coalition. Making a comparison is tough, and the reason for this is, as I said, we're still waiting for their environment and climate change policy, which is rather extraordinary. This coalition has signed up to the government's 20% emission reduction target by 2020, but they haven't actually announced policies of any detail that would actually put us on track to meet that target. And they can't tell us what emissions will be in 4 years' time if they're elected. It's interesting to make the comparison that, there's a lot of discussion about, will the budget be in the black or the red in the next 3 years? And we don't have similar discussions about, well, will emissions be going up or down in the next 4 years? It's a fairly simple question. So these are extraordinary emissions. This lack of a formal environment or climate change policy at this stage of the campaign is an extraordinary omission from both a governance and a political perspective. From a governance perspective, the coalition has failed to outline how it will tackle climate change, one of, if not the biggest issue of our time, and yet they are asking Victorians to vote for them to build the future, according to their campaign slogan. From a political viewpoint, it's a fairly extraordinary decision. The state government released a really detailed poll survey on Victorians' attitudes to the environment. Sustainability Victoria released it, and found that 86% of Victorians are either concerned or extremely concerned about the environment. And the coalition, through not delivering credible policy to actually deal with environmental issues, has effectively dismissed these community attitudes. The few environmental announcements that can be found on the coalition's website are embarrassingly thin. For instance, the coalition has a plan to save the Mordialloc Creek, but not the Murray River. And we all love our local creeks and waterways, but that's a little ridiculous. Elsewhere, the coalition has released environmental policies or policies that will actually take us backwards on the environment. Two examples of that are their plan to reintroduce cattle grazing into the alpine national parks. And the second example, they're planning policies which will make it much harder to build wind farms in Victoria. So on the one hand, they're saying that they're committed to reducing emissions by 20%, and then they're going to put a hurdle in front of one of the technologies which will actually help us achieve that target. So going back to the Turning It Around agenda, which is copies of up the back, we've rated the three major parties, and I haven't talked yet about the Greens, I'll talk about them in a moment, on their environmental policies against the Turning It Around agenda. And the results as at Tuesday, and we're doing a final update this evening when the Coalition's environment and climate change policy is hopefully released, but the results as at Tuesday were the Greens were sitting on 93%. They agreed to 93% of the policies that we thought were required. The ALP was on 50%, and the Coalition was on 15%. It will change a little. The Coalition released a water and an energy policy earlier this week, and they'll pick up a few points. The ALP has done very little in the final week. I think they're going to pick up 1 point. But by and large, that's the story that our scorecard is going to tell. And I'd really like it to be less predictable. I'd really like it to be a lot closer. But unfortunately, that's the way that it's panned out in this election campaign, where we've had so much focus on issues like preferences and so little focus on issues like policy. So while Australian politics is clearly dominated by the two major parties, Victorians clearly have other choices, and the Greens are rising rapidly in popularity, and they clearly grasp the scale of the environmental challenges we face. They may well hold the balance of power in the Legislative Council and the Upper House following the Victorian election, and we've seen federally that when that happens, it can change the politics of what's actually possible. I mean, heading into the federal election, Julia Gillard said a price on carbon was off the agenda. It was not going to happen in this term of government. And now there's detailed negotiations taking place right now about how a price on carbon will actually be introduced. We've also seen the rise of the independents at the recent federal election, and there's a number of quite strong independent candidates standing across the state. However, unless something dramatic changes in the next 44 hours before polls open, Victorians will either have a government backing incremental environmental reform or a government in complete denial about the challenges we face. And while one is clearly an improvement on the other, it won't be enough to get us out of the mess we're in. So on that uplifting note, a few words of conclusion. We face a multiplicity of environmental crises, and climate change is about to deliver the knockout punch. Business as usual politics won't cut the mustard. There are some glimmers of hope. Nationally, we may well see an effective price on carbon introduced in the next 12 months. That would make an enormous difference to the way our economy operates and prices pollution. We may well see some of the tough decisions made that will be required to save the Murray-Darling Basin. Internationally, we're seeing some great examples of leadership with countries like Germany and Spain and the US and China really getting serious about renewable energy and deploying it at mass scale and driving it down the cost curve and actually bringing online the technologies that we're going to need to tackle the climate crisis. However, on Sunday morning, when we wake up, there'll be a lot of work to do over the next 12 months and 4 years to ensure that we start acting like we're in the emergency situation that we're in. And we're up for it at Environment Victoria. We'll be working really hard to secure the outcomes that we were attempting to secure through the election process. We're very optimistic that we will actually achieve the full closure of Hazelwood Power Station in the next term of government. We know that it's possible. We've released detailed research showing how we can replace Hazelwood in as little as 2 years, and there's copies of that up the back. And we think there's very large opportunities. The federal government needs a positive story to tell on climate change. The state government, to its credit, has committed to start taking action on Hazelwood. And as I said, the company is actually calling for the full closure of the power station. So there's a real opportunity there. We've got real opportunities around getting water to the Red Gum Parks through the Murray-Darling Basin plan process. and we've got a real opportunity to achieve a price on carbon and make sure that it works. And we've got a really important piece of work as well, which is to make sure that that new coal-fired power station for Victoria doesn't go ahead, which is supported by both the ALP and the Coalition. So we're going to need your help. We're going to need the help of all Victorians. We'd love it if you join us. You can actually officially join us if you'd like to. There's membership forms up the back. But if we're not your flavour of environment organisation, join another one, because they need your help as well, and we really need a strong environment movement to turn this around. And thank you very much for your time today.